13. In 1919, by way of the Crimea and Greece, a flock of Nabokovs, 3 families in fact, fled from Russia to Western Europe. It was arranged that my brother and I would go up to Cambridge on a scholarship awarded more an atonement for political tribulations and an acknowledgment of an intellectual merit. The rest of my family expected to stay for a while in London. Living expenses were to be paid by the handful of jewels, which Natasha, a far-sighted old chambermaid, just before my mother's departure from St. Petersburg in November 1917, had swept off a dresser into a nécessaire, in which for a brief spell had undergone intermittent, or perhaps some kind of mysterious maturation in the Crimean garden. We had left our northern home for what we thought would be a brief wait, a prudent perching pause on the southern ledge of Russia, but the fury of the new regime had refused to blow over. In Greece, during 2 spring months, braving the constant resentment of intolerant shepherd dogs, I searched in vain for Gruner's orange tip, Heldrich's sulphur, Kruper's white. I was in the wrong part of the country. On the Cunard liner Pannonia, which left Greece on May 18, 1919, 21 years too soon, as far as I was concerned, for New York, but let us off at Marseille. I learned to foxtrot. France rattled by in the coal-black night. The pale Channel was still oscillating inside us when the Dover-London train quietly came to a stop. Repetitive pictures of gray pears on the grimy walls of Victoria Station advertised the bath soap English governess had used upon me in my childhood. A week later, I was already shuffling cheek to cheek at a charity ball with my first English sweetheart, a wayward, willowy girl 5 years my senior. My father had visited London before, the last time in February 1916, when 5 other prominent representatives of the Russian press he had been invited by the British government to take a look at England's war effort, which it was hinted did not meet with sufficient appreciation on the part of Russia's public opinion. On the way there, being challenged by my father and Korney Chukovsky to rhyme on Africa, the poet and novelist Alexei Tolstoy, no relation to Count Leopold Nikolaevich, had supplied, through Seasick, the charming couplet, Viju palmu e Kafrika, eto Africa. I see a palm and a little Kafir, that's Africa. In England, the visitors had been shown the fleet. Dinners and speeches were followed in noble succession. The timely capture of Erzurum by the Russians and the pending introduction of conscription in England. Will you march too, or wait till March 2? At the punning posters put it, had provided the speakers with easy topics. There had been an official banquet presided over by Sir Edward Grey, a funny interview with George V., whom Chukovsky, the enfant terrible of the group, insisted on asking if he liked the works of Oscar Wilde, G. Ozarks of Uwald. The king, who was baffled by his interrogator's accent, and who, anyway, had never been a voracious reader, neatly countered by inquiring how his guests liked the London fog. Later, Chukovsky used to cite this triumphantly as an example of British cant, tabooing a writer because of his morals. A recent visit to the public library in New York has revealed that the above incident does not appear in my father's book, Ish Voyoyushe Angli, Petrograd, 1916, a report on England at war, that indeed there are not many samples therein of his habitual humor beyond, perhaps, a description of a game of badminton, or was it fives that he had with H.G. Wells, an amusing account of a visit to some first-line trenches in Flanders, where hospitality went so far as to allow the explosion of a German grenade within a few feet of the visitors. Before publication in book form, this report appeared serially in Russian Daily. There was a certain old world naivete. My father had mentioned making a present of his swan fountain pen to Admiral Jellicoe, who at the table had borrowed it to autograph a menu card, and had praised its fluent and suave nib. This unfortunate disclosure of the pen's make was promptly echoed in the London papers by a Baby, Todd & Co. Limited advertisement, which quoted a translation of the passage and depicted my father handing the firm's product to the Commander-in-Chief of the Grand Fleet under the chaotic sky of Sea Bottle. But now there were no banquets, no speeches, and even no fives with Wells, whom it proved impossible to convince that the Bolshevism was but an especially brutal and thorough form of barbaric oppression, in itself as old as the desert sands, and not at all the attractively new revolutionary experiment that so many foreign observers took it to be. After several expensive months in a rented house in Elm Park Gardens, my parents and the three younger children left London for Berlin, where, until his death in March 1922, my father joined Yosef Hessen, a fellow member of the People's Freedom Party, in editing a Russian immigrant newspaper, while my brother and I went to Cambridge, he to Christ College, I to Trinity. I had two brothers, Sergei and Kirill. Kirill, the youngest child, 1911-1964, was also my godson, as happened in Russian families. At a certain stage of the baptismal ceremony in our Viera drawing room, I held him gingerly before handing him to his good godmother, Ekaterina Dmitrievna Danzas, my father's first cousin and grandniece of Colonel K.K. Danzas, Pushkin's second in his fatal duel. In his childhood, Kirill belonged, with my two sisters, to the remote nurseries which were so distinctly separated from his elder brother's apartments in townhouse and manor. I saw very little of him during my 2 decades of European expatriation, 1919 to 1940, and nothing at all after that until my next visit to Europe in 1960, when a brief period of very friendly and joyful meetings ensued. Kirill went to school in London, Berlin, and Prague, and to college at Louvain. He married Gilberte Barbenson, a Belgian girl, ran humorously but not unsuccessfully a travel agency in Brussels, and died of a heart attack in Munich. He loved seaside resorts and rich food. He loathed, as much as I do, bullfighting. He spoke 5 languages. He was a dedicated practical joker. His one great reality in life was literature, especially Russian poetry. His own verse reflects the influence of Gumilyov and Horesevich. Okay. Here's this picture too. And it says, my wife took unnoticed this picture, unposed, of me in the act of writing a novel in our hotel room. The hotel is the Establishment Thermal at Les Boulous in the East Pyrenees. The date, discernible on the captured calendar, is February 27, 1929. The novel, Zashita Luzhina, The Defense, deals with a defense invented by an insane chess player. Note the pattern of the tablecloth. A half-empty package of Gaulis' cigarettes can be made out between the ink bottle and the oval ashtray. Family photos are propped against the 4 volumes of Dahl's Russian Dictionary. The end of my robust dark brown pen holder, a beloved tool of young oak that I used during all my 20 years of literary labors in Europe, and may rediscover yet in one of the trunks stored at Dean's Ithaca, New York, is already well chewed. My writing hand partly conceals a stack of setting boards. Spring moths would float in through the open window on overcast nights and settle upon the lighted wall on my left. In that way we collected a number of rare pugs in perfect conditions and spread them at once. They are now in an American museum. Seldom does a casual snapshot compendiate a life so precisely. Many years ago in St. Petersburg, I remember being amused by the collected poems of a tram conductor, and especially by this picture in uniform, sturdily booted, with a pair of new rubbers on the floor beside him, and his father's war medals in the photographer's console, near which the author stood at attention. Wise conductor, far-seeing photographer. Here's another picture. A snapshot taken by my wife of our 3-year-old son Dmitri, born May 10, 1934, standing with me in front of our boarding house, Les Hesperides in Menton, at the beginning of December 1937. We looked up 22 years later. Nothing had changed except the management and the porch furniture. There is always, of course, the natural thrill of retrieved time. Beyond that, however, I get no special kick out of revisiting old emigre haunts in those incidental countries. The winter mosquitoes, I remember, were terrible. Hardly had I extinguished the light in my room than it would come, that ominous whine whose unburied, doleful, and wary rhythm contrasted so oddly with the actual mad speed of the satanic insect's gyrations. One waited for the touch in the dark, one freed a cautious arm from the bedclothes, and mightily slapped one's own ear, whose sudden hum mingled with that of the receding mosquito. But then next morning, how eagerly one reached for a butterfly net Apollo kidding one's replete tormentor, a thick, dark little bar on the white ceiling. He published sparsely and was always as reticent about his writing as he was about his persiflage amidst inner existence. For various reasons, I find it inordinately hard to speak about my other brother. That twisted quest for Sebastian Knight, 1940, with its gloriettes and self-made combinations, is really nothing in comparison to the task I balked in the first version of this memoir and am faced with now. Except for the 2 or 3 poor little adventures I have sketched in earlier chapters, his boyhood and mine seldom mingled. He is a mere shadow in the background of my richest and most detailed recollections. I was the coddled one, he the witness of the coddling. Born Caesarally 10.5 months after me on March 12, 1900, he matured earlier than I had physically looked older. We seldom played together. He was indifferent to most of the things I was fond of: toy trains, toy pistols, red idiots, red admirables. At 6 or 7, he developed a passionate adulation, condoned by Mademoiselle, for Napoleon, and took a little bronze bust of him to bed. As a child, I was rowdy, adventurous, and something of a bully. He was quiet and listless, and spent much more time with our mentors than I. At 10, he began his interest in music, and thenceforth he took innumerable lessons, went to concerts with our father, and spent hours on end playing snatches of operas on an upstairs piano well within earshot. I would creep up behind and prod him in the ribs, a miserable memory. We attended different schools. He went to my father's former gymnasia and wore the regulation black uniform, for which at 15 he added a legal touch, mouse gray spats. About that time, a page from his diary I found on his desk and read in the stupid wonder, showed it to my tutor, who promptly showed it to my father, abruptly provided a retroactive clarification of certain oddities of behavior on his part. The only game we both liked was tennis. We played a lot of it together, especially in England, on an erratic grass court in Kensington, on a good day court in Cambridge. He was left-handed. He had a bad stammer that hampered discussions of doubtful points. Despite weak service and absence of any real backhand, he was not easy to beat, being the kind of player who never double faults and returns everything with the consistency of a banging wall. In Cambridge we saw more of each other than anywhere before, and had for once a few friends in common. We both graduated in the same subjects with the same honors, after which he moved to Paris, where during the following years he gave lessons of English and Russian just as I did in Berlin. We again met in the 1930s, and were on quite amiable terms in 1938 and 1940 in Paris. He often dropped in for a chat, Rue Balou, where I lodged in 2 shabby rooms with you and our child, but it so happened he had been away for a while that he learned of our departure to America only after we had left. My bleakest recollections are associated with Paris, and the relief of leaving it was overwhelming, but I am sorry he had to stutter his astonishment to an indifferent concierge. I know little of his life during the war. At one time he was employed as translator at an office in Berlin. A frank and fearless man, he criticized the regime in front of his colleagues, who denounced him. He was arrested, accused of being a British spy, and sent to Hamburg concentration camp, where he died of inanition on January 10, 1945. It is one of those lives that hopelessly claim a belated something, compassion, understanding, no matter what, which the mere recognition of such a want can neither replace nor redeem. beginning of my first term in Cambridge was inauspicious. Late in the afternoon of a dull and damp October day, with the sense of indulging in some weird theatricals, I put on my newly acquired dark bluish academic gown and the black square cap for my first formal visit to E. Harrison, my college tutor. I went up a flight of stairs and knocked on a massive door that stood slightly ajar. "Come in," said a distant voice with hollow abruptness. I crossed a waiting room of sorts and entered my tutor's study. The brown dusk had forestalled me. There was no light in the study save for the glow of a large fireplace near which a dim figure sat in a dimmer chair. I advanced, saying, "My name is," and stepped into the tea things that stood on the rug beside Mr. Harrison's low-wicker armchair. With a grunt, he bent sideways from his seat to the right the pot, and then scooped up and dumped back into the wet black mass of tea leaves it had disgorged. Thus the college period of my life began on a note of embarrassment, a note that was to recur rather persistently during my 3 years of residence. Mr. Harrison thought it a fine idea to have one White Russian lodge with another, and so at first I shared an apartment in Trinity Lane with a puzzled compatriot. After a few months he left college, and I remained sole occupant of those lodgings. They seemed intolerably squalid in comparison with my remote and by now non-existent home. Well do I remember the ornaments on the mantelpiece, a glass ashtray with the Trinity crest left by some former lodger, a seashell in which I found the imprisoned hum of one of my own seaside summers, and my landlady's old mechanical piano, a pathetic contraption full of ruptured, crushed, knotted music, which one sampled once and no more. Narrow Trinity Lane was a staid and rather sad little street, with almost no traffic, but with a long lurid past beginning in the 16th century, when it used to be Fine Silver Lane, although commonly called at the time by a coarser name because of the then abominable state of its gutters. I suffered a good deal from the cold, but it is quite untrue, as some have it, that the polar temperature in Cambridge bedrooms caused the water to freeze solid in one's washstand jug. As a matter of fact, there would be hardly more than a thin layer of ice on the surface, and this was easily broken by means of one's toothbrush into the tinkling bits, a sound which, in retrospect, was even a certain festive appeal to my Americanized ear. Otherwise, getting up was no fun at all. I still feel in my bones the bleakness of the morning walk up Trinity Lane to the baths, as one shuffled along, exuding pallid puffs of breath, in a thin dressing gown over one's pajamas, and with a cold, fat sponge bag under one's arm. Nothing in the world could induce me to wear next to my skin the woolies that kept Englishmen secretly warm. Overcoats were considered sissy, the usual attire of the average Cambridge undergraduate, whether athlete or leftist poet, struck a sturdy and dingy note. His shoes had thick rubber soles, his flannel trousers were dark gray, and the button sweater, called a jumper, under his Norfolk jacket was conservative brown. What I suppose might be termed the gray set wore old pumps, very light gray flannel trousers, a bright yellow jumper, and the coat part of a good suit. By that time my youthful preoccupation with clothes was set on the wane. But it did seem rather a lark after the formal fashions in Russia to go about in slippers, eschewed garters, and wear one's collar sewn into one's shirt, a daring innovation in those days. The mild masquerade in which I indolently joined has left such trifling impressions upon my mind that it would be tedious to continue in this strain. The story of my college years in England is really the story of my trying to become a Russian writer. I had the feeling that Cambridge and all its frayed features, venerable elms, blazoned windows, loquacious tower clocks, were of no consequence in themselves, but existed merely to frame and support my rich nostalgia. Emotionally, I was in the position of a man who, having just lost a found kinswoman, realized too late that through some laziness of the routine-drugged human soul he had neither troubled to know her as fully as she deserved, nor had shown her in the full marks of his not quite conscious then, but now unrelieved, affection. As with smarting eyes meditated by the fire in my Cambridge room, all the potent banality of embers, solitude, and distant chimes pressed against me, contorting the very folds of my face, as an airman's face is disfigured by the fantastic speed of his flight. And I thought of all I had missed in my country, of the things I would not have omitted to note and treasure, had I suspected before that my life was to veer in such a violent way. To some of the several fellow immigrés I met in Cambridge, the general trend of my feelings was so obvious and familiar a thing that it would have fallen flat and seemed almost improper if I put it into words. With the wider of those White Russians, I soon found out that patriotism and politics boiled down to a snarling resentment which was directed more against Kerensky than against Lenin, and which proceeded solely from material discomforts and losses. Then, too, I ran into some quite unexpected difficulties with such of my English acquaintances as were considered to be cultured and subtle and humane, but who, for all their decency and refinement, would lapse into the most astonishing drivel when Russia was being discussed. I want to single out here a young socialist I knew, a lanky giant whose slow and multiple manipulations of a pipe were horribly aggravating when you did not agree with him, and delightfully soothing when you did. With him I had many political wrangles, the bitterness of which invariably dissolved when we turned to the poets we both cherished. Today he is not unknown among his peers, which is, I readily admit, a pretty meaningless phrase, referred to him by some name of Nesbit. I dubbed him, or affirm now as having dubbed him, not only because of his alleged resemblance to early portraits of Maxim Gorky, a regional mediocrity in that era, of one of those first stories my fellow traveler, another apt to note, had been translated by a certain R. Nesbit Bain, but also because Nesbit has the advantage of entering into voluptuous palindromic association with Isbin, a name I shall have to evoke presently. It is probably true, as some have argued, that sympathy for Leninism on the part of English and American liberal opinion in the 20s was swung by consideration of home politics, but it was also due to simple misinformation. My friend knew little of Russia's past, and this little had come to him through polluted communist channels. When challenged to justify the bestial terror that had been sanctioned by Lenin, the torture house, the blood-bespattered wall, Nesbit would tap the ashes out of his pipe against the fender knob, recross sinisterly his huge, heavily shod, dexterly crossed legs, and murmur something about the Allied blockade. He lumped together as czarist elements, Russian emigres of all hues, from present socialist to white general, much as today Soviet writers wield the term fascist. He never realized that he and other foreign idealists been Russian and Russia. He and they would have been destroyed by Lenin's regime as naturally as rabbits are by ferrets and farmers. He maintained that the reason for what he demurely called less variety of opinion under the Bolsheviks ran in the darkest Tsarist days was the want of any tradition of free speech in Russia, a statement he got, I believe, from the sort of fatuous dawn in Russia stuff that eloquent English and American Leninists wrote in those years, but the thing that irritated me perhaps most was Nesbit's attitude toward Lenin himself. All cultured and discriminating Russians knew that this astute politician had about as much taste and interest in aesthetic matters as ordinary Russian bourgeois of the Flaubertian epicure sort, the type that admired Pushkin on the strength of Tchaikovsky's vile librettos, wept at the Italian opera, and was allured by any painting that told a story, but Nesbit and his highbrow friend saw in him a kind of sensitive, poetic-minded patron and promoter of the newest trends in art, and would smile a superior smile when I tried to explain that the connections between advanced politics and advanced art was a purely verbal one, gleefully exploited by Soviet propaganda, that the more radical a Russian was in politics, the more conservative he was on the artistic side. I had at my disposal a number of such truths that I liked to air, but that Nesbit, firmly entrenched in his ignorance, regarded as mere fancies. The history of Russia, I might for example declare, could be considered from 2 points of view, both of which for some reason equally annoyed Nesbit. First, as the evolution of the police, a curiously impersonal and detached force, sometimes working in a kind of void, sometimes helpless, and at other times outdoing the government in brutal persecution. And second, as the development of marvelous culture. Under the Tsars, I might go on, despite the fundamentally inept and ferocious character of their rule, a freedom-loving Russian had incomparably more means of expressing himself and used to run incomparably risk of doing so than under Lenin. Since the reforms of the 1860s, the country had possessed, though not always adhered to, a legislation of which any Western democracy might have been proud. A vigorous public opinion that held despots at bay, widely read periodicals of all shades and liberal political thought, and what was especially striking, fearless and independent judges. Oh, come, Nesbit would interpose, when revolutionaries did get caught, banishment to Tomsk or Omsk, now Bomsk, was a resentful vacation in comparison to the concentration camps that Lenin introduced. Political exiles escaped from Siberia with partial ease. Witness a famous flight from Trotsky, let Santa Leo, Santa Claus, Trotsky, merrily riding back in Yuletide sleigh drawn by the reindeer, on rocket, on stupid on, butcher and blisson. I soon became aware that if my views, the not unusual views of Russian Democrats abroad, were received with pained surprise or polite sneers by English Democrats in situ, another group, the English ultra-conservatives, rallied eagerly to my side, but so did from a crude reactionary motivation that I was only embarrassed by their despicable support. Indeed, I pride myself with having discerned even then the symptoms of what is so clear today, when a kind of family circle has gradually been formed, linking representatives of all nations, jolly empire builders in their jungle clearings, French policemen, the unmentionable German products, the good old church-going Russian or Polish pogromщик, the lean American lyncher, the man with the bad teeth who squirts anti-mandatory stories in the bar or the lavatory, at another point of the same subhuman circle, those ruthless, paste-faced automatons in opulent John-held trousers and high-shouldered jackets, those sit-serious looming at all our conference tables, whom, or shall I say which, the Soviet state began to export around 1945 after more than 2 decades of selective breedings and tailoring, during which men's fashions abroad had had time to change, so that the symbol of infinitely available cloth could only provoke cruel derision, as occurred in post-war England, when a famous Soviet team of professional soccer players happened to parade in mufti. Very soon I turned away from politics and concentrated on literature. I invited to my Cambridge rooms the vermilion shields and blue lightning of the Song of Igor's Campaign, that incomparable and mysterious epic of the late 12th or 18th century, the poetry of Pushkin and Tuchev, the prose of Gogol and Tolstoy, and also the wonderful works of the great Russian naturalists who had explored and described the wilds of Central Asia. At a bookstall in the marketplace, I unexpectedly came upon Russian work, a second-hand copy of Dahl's Interpretive Dictionary of the Living Russian Language in 4 volumes. I bought it and resolved to read at least 10 pages per day, jotting down such words and expressions as might especially please me, and I kept this up for a considerable time. My fear of losing or corrupting through alien influence, the only thing I had salvaged from Russia, her language, became positively morbid and considerably more harassing than the fear I was to experience 2 decades later of my never being able to bring my English prose anywhere close to the level of my Russian. I used to sit up far into the night, surrounded by an almost quixotic accumulation of unwieldy volumes, to make polished and rather sterile Russian poems, not so much out of the live cells of some compelling emotion, as around the vivid term of verbal image that I wanted to use for its own sake. It would have horrified me at a time to discover that I see so clearly now the direct influence upon my Russian structures of various contemporaneous Georgian English verse patterns that were running about my room and all over me like tame mice, and to think of the labor I expended. Suddenly, in the small hours of a November morning, I would become conscious of the silence and chill. My second winter in Cambridge seems to have been the coldest and the most prolific one. The red and blue flames, wherein I had been seeing a fabled battle, had sunk to the lugubrious glow of an Arctic sunset among hoary firs. Still, I could not force myself to go to bed, dreading not so much insomnia as the inevitable double systole, abetted by the cold of the sheets, and also the curious affection called anxietas tibiarium, a painful condition of unrest, an excruciating increase of muscular sense which leads to a continual change in the position of one's limbs. So I would heap on more coals and help revive the flames by spreading a sheet of the London Times over the smoking black jaws of the fireplace, thus screening completely its open recess. A humming noise would start behind the taut paper, which would acquire the smoothness of drumskin and the beauty of luminous parchment. Presently, as the hum turned into a roar, an orange-colored spot would appear in the middle of the sheet, and whatever patch of print happened to be there in it, for example, "The League does not command a guinea or gun," or "The revenges that the Nemesis has had upon Allied hesitation and indecision in Eastern and Central Europe," stood out with ominous clarity until suddenly the orange spot burst. Then the flaming sheet, with the whir of a liberated phoenix, would fly up the chimney to join the stars. It cost one a fine of 12 shillings if that firebird was observed. The literary set, Nesbit and his friends, while commending my nocturnal labors, frowned upon various other things I went in for, such as entomology, practical jokes, girls, and especially athletics. Of the games I played at Cambridge, soccer has remained a wind-swept clearing in the middle of a rather muddled period. I was crazy about goalkeeping. In Russia and the Latin countries, the gallant art had been always surrounded by a halo of singular glamour. Aloof, solitary, and passive, the crack goalie is swallowed in the streets by entrenched small boys. He beats with the matador and the flying ace as an object of thrilled adulation. His sweater, his peaked cap, his knee guards, the gloves protruding from his pocket of his shorts set him apart from the rest of the team. He is the lone eagle, the man of mystery, the last defender. Photographers reverently bending one knee snap him in the act of making a spectacular dive across the goal mouth to deflect with his fingertips a low lightning-like shot. And the stadium roars in approval as he remains for a moment or two lying in full length where he fell, his goal still intact. But in England, at least in the England of my youth, the national dread of showing off and a too grim preoccupation with the solid teamwork were not conductive of the development of the goalie's eccentric art. This at least was the explanation I dug up for not being over successful on the playing fields at Cambridge. Oh, to be sure, I had my bright racing days, the good smell of turf, the famous inter-varsity forward dribbling closer and closer to me with the new tawny ball at his twinkling toe, and then stinging shot, the lucky save, its protracted tingle. But there were other, more memorable, more esoteric days under dismal skies, with the goal area a mass of black mud, the ball as greasy as a plum pudding, and my head racked with neuralgia after a sleepless night of verse-making. I would fumble badly and retrieve the ball from the net. Mercifully, the game would swing on to the opposite end of the sodden field. A weak, weary drizzle would start, hesitate, and go on again. With an almost cooing tenderness in their subdued croaking, dilapidated rooks would be flapping about a leafless elm. Mists would gather. Now the game would be vague bobbing of heads near the remote goal of St. John's or Christ, or whatever college we were playing. The far blurred sounds, a cry, a whistle, the thud of a kick, all that was perfectly unimportant and had no connection with me. I was less the keeper of a soccer goal than the keeper of a secret. As with folded arms I leant my back against the left goal post, I enjoyed the luxury of closing my eyes, and thus I would listen to my heart knocking and feel the blind drizzle on my face and hear in the distance the broken sounds of the game and think of myself as the fabulous exotic being in an English footballer's disguise, composing verse in a tongue nobody understood about a remote country nobody knew. Small wonder I was not very popular with my teammates. Not once in my 3 years in Cambridge, repeat, not once did I visit the university library, or even bother to locate it. I know its new place now. Or find out if there existed a college library where books might be borrowed for reading in one's digs. I skipped lectures, I sneaked to London, and elsewhere I conducted several love affairs simultaneously. I had dreadful interviews with Mr. Harrison. I translated into Russian a score of poems by Rupert Brooke, Alice in Wonderland of Romain Rolland's Colas Brugnon. Scholastically, I might as well have gone up to the Inst M.M. of Tirana. Such things as the hot muffins and crumpets one had with one's tea after games, the newsboys' cockingish cries of "Piper, Piper," mingling with the bicycle bells in the darkening street, seemed to me at the time more characteristic of Cambridge than they do now. I cannot help realizing that aside from striking but more or less transient customs, the deeper the ritual or rule, there did exist the residual something about Cambridge that many a solemn alumnus was tried to define. I see this basic property as the constant awareness one had of an untrammeled extension of time. I do not know if anyone will ever go to Cambridge in search of the imprints which the teat cleats of my soccer boots have left in the back mud before a gaping goal, or follow the shadow of my cap across the quadrangle to my tutor's stairs, but I know that I thought of Milton, of Marvell, of Marlowe, with more than a tourist thrill as I passed beside the revered walls. Nothing one looked at was shut off in terms of time. Everything was a natural opening into it, so that one's mind grew accustomed to work in a particularly pure and ample environment, and because in terms of space, the narrow lane, the cloistered lawn, the dark archway hampered one physically, that yielding diaphanous texture of time was by contrast especially welcome to the mind, just as the sea view from a window exhilarates one hugely, even though one does not care for sailing. I had no interest whatever in the history of the place, and was quite sure that Cambridge was in no way affecting my soul, although actually it was Cambridge that supplied not only the casual frame, but also the very colors and inner rhythms for my very special Russian thoughts. Environment, I suppose, does act upon a creature, if there is in the creature already certain responsive particle or strain, the English I had imbibed in my childhood. Of this I had my first inkling just before leaving Cambridge, during my last and saddest spring there, when I suddenly felt that something in me was as naturally in contact with my immediate surroundings as it was with my Russian past, and that in this state of harmony had been reached at the very moment when that careful reconstruction of my artificial but beautifully exact Russian world had been at least completed. I think one of the very few practical actions I have ever been guilty of was to use in part that crystalline material to obtain an honors degree. I remember the dreamy flow of punts and canoes on the cam, the Hawaiian whine of the phonograph slowly passing through sunshine and shade, a girl's hand gently twirling this way and that, the handle of her peacock-bright parasol as she reclined on the cushions of the punt which I dreamily navigated. The pink-coned chestnuts were in full fan. They made overlapping masses along the banks. They crowded the sky out of the river, and their special pattern of flowers and leaves produced a kind of en escalier effect, the angular figuration of some splendid green in an old rose tapestry. The air was as warm in the Crimea, with the same sweet, fluffy smell of a certain flowering bush that I never could quite identify. I later caught whiffs of it in the gardens of the southern states. The three arches of an Italianate bridge, spanning the narrow stream, combined to form, with the help of their almost perfect, almost unrippled replicas in the water, three lovely ovals. In its turn, the water cast a patch of lacy light on the stone in the enterrados, under which one's gliding craft passed. Now and then, shed by a blossoming tree, a petal would come down, 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 and with the odd feeling of seeing something neither worshipper nor casual spectator ought to see, one would manage to glimpse its reflection, which swiftly, more swiftly than petal fell, rose to meet it, and for the fraction of a second one feared that the trick would not work, that the blessed oil would not catch fire, that the reflection might miss, and the petal float away alone. But every time the delicate union did take place, the magic precision of a poet's word meeting halfway his or a reader's recollection. When after an absence of almost 17 years I revisited England, I made the dreadful mistake of going to see Cambridge again, not at the glorious end of the Easter term, but on a raw February day that reminded me only of my own confused old nostalgia. I was hopelessly trying to find an academic job in England, the ease of which I obtained the type of employment in USA is to me, and back thought, a constant source of grateful wonder. In every way the visit was not a success. I had lunch with Nesbit at a little place which ought to have been full of memories, but which, owing to various changes, was not. He had given up smoking, time had softened his features, and he no longer resembled Gorky or Gorky's translator, but looked a little like Ibsen, minus the simian vegetation. An accidental worry, the cousin or maid and sister who kept house for him had just been removed to Bidet's clinic or something, seemed to prevent him from concentrating on the very personal and urgent matter I wanted to speak to him about. Beyond, volumes of punch were heaped on a table in a kind of small vestibule where a bowl of goldfish had formerly stood. It all looked so different. Different, too, were the garish uniforms worn by the waitresses, of whom none was as pretty as the particular one I remembered so clearly. Rather desperately, as if struggling against boredom, Ibsen launched into politics. I knew well what to expect, denunciation of Stalinism. In the early 20s, Nesbit had mistaken his own ebullient idealism for romantic and humane something, and Lenin's ghastly rule. Ibsen, in the days of the no less ghastly Stalin, was mistaking a quantitative increase in his own knowledge for a qualitative change in the Soviet regime, but the thunderclap of purges that had affected old Bolsheviks. The heroes of his youth had given him a salutary shock, something that in Lenin's day all the groans coming from the Solovki forced labor camp of the Lubyanka dungeon had not been able to do. With horror he pronounced the names of Ezhov and Yagoda, but quite forgot their predecessors Uritsky and Dzerzhinsky. While time had improved his judgment regarding contemporary Soviet affairs, he did not bother to reconsider the preconceived notions of his youth, and still saw in Lenin's short reign a kind of glamorous quincundium neuronis. He looked at his watch, and I looked at mine, and we parted, and I wandered around the town in the rain, and then visited the backs, and for some time peered at the rocks in the black network of the bare elms, and at first crocuses in the midst bearded turf. As I strolled under those sung trees, I tried to put myself into the same ecstatically reminiscent mood in regard to my student years as during those years I had experienced in regard to my boyhood, but all I could evoke were fragmentary little pictures. M.K., a Russian, dyspeptically cursing the after effects of a college hall dinner. N.R., another Russian, romping about like a child. P.M., storming into my room with a copy of Ulysses freshly smuggled from Paris. J.C., quietly dropping in to say that he too had just lost his father. R.C., charmingly inviting me to join him on a trip to the Swiss Alps. Christopher, or something or other, wriggling out of a proposed tennis double upon learning that his partner was to be a Hindu. T., a very old, fragile waiter, spilling the soup in hall on Professor A.E. Hausman. who then abruptly stood up as one shooting out of a trance. S.S., who was in no way connected with Cambridge, but who, having dozed off in his chair at a literary party in Berlin, and being nudged by a neighbor, also stood up. Suddenly, in the middle of a story someone was reading, Lewis Carroll's Dormouse, unexpectedly starting to tell a tale. E. Harrison, unexpectedly making me a present, The Shropshire Lad, a little volume of verse about young males and death. The dull day had dwindled to a pale yellow streak in the grey west, when, acting upon an impulse, I decided to visit my old tutor. Like a sleepwalker, I mounted the familiar steps and automatically knocked on the half-open door bearing his name. In a voice that was a jot less abrupt and a trifle more hollow, he bade me come in. "I wonder if you remember me," I started to say as I crossed the dim room to where he sat near a comfortable fire. "Let me see," he said, slowly turning around in his slow chair. I do not quite seem. There was a dismal crunch, a fatal clatter. I had stepped into the tea things that stood at the front of his wicker chair. "Oh, yes, of course," he said. "I know who you are." The small butterfly, light blue above, grayish beneath, of which the two type specimens, male holotype on the left, both sides, one hind wing slightly damaged, and male paratype on the right, both sides, preserved in the American Museum of Natural History, and figured now for the first time from photographs made by that institution, is Plebejus Lysandra Cormion Nabokov. The first name is that of the genus, of the second of that subgenus, the third of that species, and the fourth of that author of the original description, which I published in September of 1941, Journal of the New York Entomological Society, Volume 49, page 265, later figuring the genitalia of the paratype, October 26, 1945, Psyche, Volume 52, Part 1. Possibly, as I pointed out, my butterfly owed its origin to a hybridization between Plebejus Lysandra corridenpoda, in the large sense, and Plebejus Milligeria daphnis schiffer-millen. Live organisms are less conscious of specific or subgeneric differences than the taxonomist is. I took the two males figured, and saw at least two more, but no females, on July 20 paratype and 22 holotype, 1938, at about 4,000 feet near the village of Molinet, Alpes Maritimes. It may not rank high enough to deserve a name, but whatever it be, a new species in the making, a striking sport or chance cross, it remains a great and delightful rarity.